Okay, anon. So a really cool story from the real lineman from the Soviet Union breaks into the thread. Well, anon, there are quite a lot of people in the subway at night, so stories about homeless people eaten at night are bullshit and a provocation. As for me, at night, tension is removed from the rails and workers and linemen descend into the subway. My grandfather was such a lineman. I communicated very well with him, lived nearby, often went to the river to fish. And he was telling me cool stories about the subway in the process. So, the essence of the work of a lineman, at night, walk through the tunnel and shine a flashlight on the rails, check for breakdowns, some kind of garbage on the rails and all that. If there is something, then remove it, and if you cannot fix it yourself, then call workers to fix it. The work itself is tough anon, isn't it? Walking in a dark tunnel alone with a flashlight and proving to yourself that you are a citizen of the Soviet Union and you don't need to be afraid of unknown garbage. And if anything, then the valiant police will save you. Well, after working there for several years, one day my grandfather, already accustomed to this whole thing, walked through the tunnel, mechanically inspecting the rails. He was walking from Porovo station to Novogorivo, and then had to go to the depot to report. Well, the bottom line is that he was walking, and suddenly he saw such a picture in front of him. In front of him was as if a cobweb of rust. He looked closely and realized that they were fittings. Rusty, old and twisted into such a construction. Well, then he got a little crazy. How could this crap appear in a few hours? Naturally, he shifted in order, but Porovo was already far away. It was much closer to Novogorivo. So he did not return to report, but decided to do it in Novogorivo. Further, anon, he became completely gloomy during telling this. But he is the most cheerful person. A womanizer, so to speak. His last wife was 27. He was 54. Well, he stumbled upon the same construction, but it was braided with intestines and seemed to be breathing, moving. And no matter how he shone a flashlight further into the tunnel, there was absolutely nothing to be seen, as if a wall of darkness, and from there some rustles, sobs, pleas were heard. This is how my grandfather described it. So, anon, he shitted a whole mountain, blocked the tunnel completely and rushed in the opposite direction to Porovo. Having run somehow, he called the dispatcher by the local connection and told them about all that. He was summoned to the office, asked to repeat everything again, forced to sign on a piece of paper about non-disclosure and let him go home, giving almost a week off. Here is such a cool story, dear anon, so think about what the hell is going on there at night. I have over 9,000 cool stories about my grandfather and his colleagues at that work. I will already file them in the next creepy threads. Another cool story from grandfather. That time, as he said, their sector was not yet the most gloomy. The sector from the Tretiakovskaya station to the Novogorivo station. Not many people were disappearing there and most of them were being found later. Although, according to him, if you go wrong way you are lost and no matter whether anyone tries to look for you or not, you won't be found. Their shift was in contact with men from other shifts. They told absolutely terrible stories there. Especially there was a fucking hell on the ring. According to grandfather, maybe the men scared them, but according to their stories, someone hung linemen and workers there. It used to happen that a lineman would find a piece of rail that had come from nowhere, calling workers, leading to a place. Then no answer, no hello. They were found hanging on hooks nailed to the ceiling of the tunnel, taken from no one knows where. Well, grandfather was skeptical about all this. He didn't see that himself. He didn't know those men well. Now the story itself. He made his rounds as always, walking somewhere between Marksistskaya and Ilyich Square. He walks and hears rustling behind him. Stops, shines back, nothing. Well, he thinks, it seemed that he barely got up for the shift, the day before he drank too much with friends. His head is noisy. You never know. But no, he goes and hears it. Stops, the noise subsides. He stands and stares into the darkness beyond the circle of light from the lantern, and it seems to himself that someone is looking at him from the darkness, giving him goosebumps. He walked a little back, nothing seemed to be, but then he noticed barely visible trace on the sleepers. Either pus, or some kind of ichor, rubbish in general. How much he shines there, that shit is in a straight line on the sleepers, and several sleepers seem to have rotted. All cracked, he could not describe it normally. But in front of him, towards the station, everything was clear. Then of course, he shitted his pants, almost ran to the station, and behind him that same rustle. Went out onto the platform, he stood and looked into the darkness. And his legs were trembling. Nothing. Well, he thinks he caught a squirrel. He went to the station chief's closet, didn't say anything about pus, said that several sleepers are broken and that a worker is needed to let him assess the damage if he can. Then let him fix it. They told him to go to the workers' rest room, where there was only one person who introduced himself as Rodian. Such a smiling, young guy, he said that he was studying at a technical school as a locksmith, working on the night shift, replacing workers when necessary. Again, grandfather did not say anything about pus. He thought he might notice it himself. But no, he walked all the way, talking incessantly about his parents and his girlfriend, not noticing anything around. As a result, grandfather brought him to a place with broken sleepers. He stands, looks around, listens, but nothing is heard. The guy keeps talking. Well, Rodian looked at the damage, said that it was serious shit, that the sleepers need to be changed. Now he will patch it up somehow. But then he will call the repair team. Well, grandfather already thought that everything that really seemed, said goodbye to the guy, shook hands, went on. The work had to be done. There was still a lot of work to get around. He walked away about 10 meters and suddenly heard not even a scream from behind, but something like a sob and a thud. Shined back and saw Rodian's face at the very edge of the circle of light. He rushed to him and realized that something was dragging the guy into the tunnel. And he didn't even scream, he just looked at grandfather silently. The worst thing, according to grandfather, is that it was as if all the blood vessels in his eyes had burst. His eyes were red. And what's dragging the guy is not visible. Something shiny flashes in the light of the lantern and a wheezing comes from there. And you won't understand whether the guy is wheezing, or whether that's shit. As a result, my grandfather rushed out of there with fright, as he had never run in his life. And until those very times, when he told me this story, he was ashamed for not helping the guy. So, he ran to the station. The head of the station was standing in his closet, looking at grandfather like an asshole. Grandfather, stammering, trembling with fear, tells what he saw. The head of the station looks at grandfather like an even more drunken asshole and is interested in the name of the worker who went with him. Grandfather replied, Rodian. They entered the worker's room. Rodian was sitting on the couch. The station head called him, but there was zero reaction. Grandfather already had a very bad feeling. The boss shook the guy's shoulder. It turned out he was sleeping. He awoke, turned to them. Grandfather sees that his eyes are red, not like then, but still the feeling that the guy has not slept for several days. His face looked haggard. He gets up silently. And then grandfather sees that he has blood on his uniform in the abdomen. It's fucking bloody. But it doesn't look curdled yet. They look and there is already a bloody stain on the sofa. The boss, already pissed off, asks what happened. Rodian is silent for a few seconds, then very quietly says that he cut himself. The chief says, sit here, now I'll call an ambulance. Grandfather immediately went out after him. They called the chief of doctors and the police from the chamber at the same time. They met them, led them to the station. They saw such a small bloody trail, literally droplets, stretching from the workers' room to the tracks. Rodian, of course, was not in the room. And again grandfather was harnessed to go along with the policemen into the tunnel. Brought them, well, they didn't find anything, in general. They found only a box with tools where the sleepers were broken. The cops shrugged their shoulders and left. This time the head of the station said not to talk too much about this case. He said that we'll sort everything out himself. There was no need in Gabney. Grandfather after that for the first time seriously thought about changing job. He was scared as fuck. Now to grandfather's stories. Everything will be about the subway. The most interesting stories are from this segment of his life. Although there are a couple of interesting stories from the time when he was a conductor on the Leningrad-Moscow train. So, they had their own team of trackers basically, those who worked in the same shift. After the detour, in the middle of the night, closer to morning, gathered in the back room, drank a couple of glasses of blue and were telling stories. What had happened to them during the detour. Usually that was bullshit. But there was one man who was very inconspicuous, as the grandfather said, but the essence is that he was formerly either a zoologist or a biologist and was drinking too much. By acquaintance he got at least one such job. So, after the detours, he constantly flooded his colleagues with his incredible stories that the metro is a whole new ecosystem. You just need to dig deeper into the main paths and everyone will understand everything themselves. Well, they listened to him with half an ear, nodded, and were saying, yes, good, well done. Grandfather also listened with half an ear. He did not listen to completely crazy theories, clearly invented under the squirrel. Once, the grandfather and one other lineman stayed up longer than usual. They didn't want to go home, and then that drunken man burst into the back room with some strange stories. They had to listen to the mad scientist, as he was called. He told very strange things. Like, he walked along the paths, looked into all the dark corners in the hope of finding a new branch of evolution. You see, he compensated for his longing for science. As a result, he got into some kind of passage, which obviously had not been used for a long time. Abandoned, in a word. He said that at the end of the tunnel, at a dead end, he got paralyzed. He said that out of the darkness a voice spoke to him, which allegedly ordered him to bring more people so that he could reveal something to them. Whoever told him all this, he could not clearly answer. He spoke about some kind of web from the darkness and, strangely, not a word about a new branch of evolution. Well, the men twirled their fingers at the head and went home. Eventually, over the next few nights, that scientist approached all the linemen, suggesting that they go with him. They didn't report him to the police. They thought that he would get away from alcohol a little. He would become normal. So one day he went on a detour and disappeared. Moreover, according to the grandfather, he took neither a flashlight nor a jacket. He was gone for a few days, just disappeared. They sent a whole shift to look for him. The chief thought that he got somewhere drunk and got lost. They didn't want to involve the police, not to spoil their reputation. In the end, this is what my grandfather said. They walked for quite a long time, from the Tretiakowskaya station to the Enthusiasts Highway, until they found that guy's glasses somewhere between the Enthusiasts Highway and Purovo. Then they found his watch, moreover. They were laying in a side branch. Well, together it seems to be not scary, so they decided to go there. As a result, after 5 minutes of walking, they decided to go back. Someone heard strange whispers. Someone was simply being pressed by the walls. I understand that, according to grandfather, all the beams were rusty. The wood was rotten. It was unpleasant to be there. As a result, 7 healthy men got scared and went back, moreover. They almost ran. Then they baited stories that someone allegedly saw that man loitering in this place or heard his voice from the darkness. But stories are stories. You never know what they saw and heard, until on one day, after about 2 months. On the same section of the tracks they found corpse. Almost a bare skeleton. Nearby, clothes were neatly folded, in which the documents of that man were found. The corpse was notably gnawed, as grandfather said. In the end, they wrote off the fact that he got lost drunk, died of dehydration, and was gnawed by rats. But grandfather saw the corpse and the marks on the bones were such that the rat obviously would not leave. Some bones were almost grounded into flour. Again, rats will not fold clothes neatly and will not drag a whole skeleton along the way. Such a thing happened. I didn't add anything from myself. I wrote everything from the words of grandfather. Guys, the lineman's grandson is here. Now there will be a story with almost no mysticism, but still creepy. In my opinion, grandfather once made his planned detour. Everything went as usual. No damage to the tracks, nothing like that, but still he doesn't relax. The other day a man disappeared on the tracks. A lineman from another shift. Goes for himself, thinks of his own and suddenly sees a light in the distance. He thinks, what the fuck is that? There should be no one beside him. He stood for a few seconds, thinking what it might be there. Isn't it time to fuck off? Because, as people who worked there for more than 1 year told him, if you see or even hear something suspicious, then it's better to immediately leave as quickly as possible and not think about who you will seem like a fool there. But you will be safer. Well, in the meantime, the light became closer and from the darkness a voice called out to him, who was walking supposedly. Grandfather calmed down a little when he recognized the voice. The man was from a different shift, but they saw each other quite often, because he often looked into their closet at the depot to drink and talk, saying that he didn't have many friends outside of work. The man, by the way, was already old. He had worked as a lineman for about 15 years, as grandfather said. Well, grandfather, having calmed down, went to a meeting, shines a flashlight, and indeed this man is standing, squinting from the light. All wrinkled, obviously with a hangover. They greeted, shook hands. Well, grandfather asked him, wasn't he that disappeared man? He answered, not him, another guy. They had a new one on the shift. Well, then grandfather asked him why he came then. This wasn't his shift. He replied that the day before he lost his wallet with documents, apparently on the tracks. And when he came home, he drank half a liter, fell asleep, and didn't reveal that immediately. Well, grandfather says, he went around all the way, and didn't see any documents and wallets. The man asked grandfather to go on both sides of the paths and look for the wallet. Maybe it lies somewhere. Where could it go? Grandfather thinks that he has already passed half. It's not his fault to go back, but on the other hand, the man is a good person. and without documents he would have problems. But the lineman also had such a belief, even a custom, that if you fucked up something on the tracks, then you can't return for it. A bad omen? But still, he decided to help this man. They're walking. Grandfather on one side, a man on the other. They walked almost silently. They discussed only the missing person. Grandfather, remembering the incident with that biologist, asked him if that man had asked anything strange, or behaved somehow wrong. But no, according to the man, the guy was quite ordinary. He behaved adequately. He only constantly was interested in all sorts of oddities. About rats the size of a dog and everything else. Well, they teased him. They told him that they were even the size of a cow, and then they laughed at him the whole shift, but that's okay. The newbie. Passed 2 stations already, found nothing. Suddenly they hear not far away and somewhere on the side, from the side of the peasant, strange sounds, some kind of crunch. Quite loud though. Both stood up as if rooted to the spot and were silent. And suddenly the sound stops, then it starts again. They looked at each other. The man says in a whisper, "Let's see what's there," and nods his head back to the tunnel, saying, "Let's escape quickly." And grandfather answers, "We don't know what is covered in the wiring, maybe it sparks there. The wires broke, let's go and see." They walk slowly, carefully, side by side. They shine on the wall of the tunnel from the sound side. Suddenly the light went beyond the wall. They see that the technical passage, quite wide, seems to go down at an angle. They approached and already both of them shine. The sound is very close. From the depths of the passage is heard. They shine on the walls, and there are such, as if children's drawings drawn by crayon, all sorts of little men and some kind of garbage. He couldn't remember exactly. They walked just a few meters and both stood in their tracks. They saw 2 figures in the aisle, hunched and naked, very thin. Grandfather said that even the bones were stuck out, just skin. The figures are leaning over something. Something, according to grandfather, turned out to be some kind of shapeless, bloody pile of rags. As grandfather later recalled, telling me this, the rags resembled the uniform of a subway worker. In principle. Then both figures got up and turned to grandfather and the man. Overgrown, thin, sort of like people, only there was something wrong with them. Something bestial, as grandfather said. Some dozen or a little more meters separated them. At first, they covered their faces with their hands, and then they began to look point blank at the linemen. Grandfather could not even describe this look. Their eyes were like those of an animal. They did not express anything, they simply stared blankly ahead. The men began to back away. These figures began to hobble after them. Slowly, hunched over and also looking directly at them. Grandfather said that it was as if he was under hypnosis. There would be no way to run as fast as he could. He backed away and looked into his eyes until he rested his back against the wall of the main tunnel. The man was next to him. The figure stood in the aisle, without leaving it, and just as silently looked at the linemen. Grandfather also said that he seemed to see more figures in the light of the lantern behind them, but he was not sure. And then something seemed to click in both linemen. They ran as fast as they could in the direction of the station. When the linemen finally got to the station, they did not even look back. They just ran further to the depot itself. Fortunately, they were already at the final one. They went out into the street and went to that man's house. Without even reporting this garbage, still shaking with fear. They silently drank vodka in the kitchen until they both passed out right at the table. Anon, by the way, they found the man's documents in the morning. Suddenly, in the refrigerator. Maybe, when he got drunk the other day, he put it there drunk. This story was told to me by my neighbor, an old grandfather who had worked in the subway for 50 years. Not less. At first he was a machinist, and after, when his health got worse, he was put in some position at the station. And just when he was working there, an incident happened. Events were restored later according to eyewitnesses. A group of typical Russian gangsters stumbled into the subway train, since the station was close to their habitats. They were boozy, but still in moderation. The whole gangsta group was yelling something, arguing about something. Well, everything was as usual. The train didn't go long. Something happened there, and the whole thing stopped in the tunnel. They stood for a couple of minutes, but, as usual, their nature demanded courage, and with a cry of "What the fuck is happening?" one of them opened the door of the train and got out into the tunnel. It must be added that this was the last train cabin, and the station was no more than 5 minutes away. In general, a cheerful gangster went to the station. Kind people told the machinist about the man in the tunnel. He himself had already seen that the doors were being opened. And he handed it over to the station. Well, they had already removed the voltage from the contact rail, and quickly assembled a team to catch him. a couple of cops, some man from the station, and my neighbor. The whole thing took about 10 minutes, and since no one appeared from the tunnel, all the station authorities decided that they would soon bring in a well-fried carcass of an idiot who had managed to touch the contact rail before the voltage was removed. As the neighbor said, they found the guy not far from the station. As they walked, no one heard or saw anything. The people at the station too. But when they returned, the hair of the cops turned gray sharply, and the station chief was generally brought in his arms with a heart attack. The boy was lying on the tracks with his legs crossed. And the point was not that he was looking towards the station, his mouth gaping, as if in a scream, and not that his face was frozen in a grimace of horror. Even the fact that he was completely gray-haired was not so scary. It was something else. The guy was lying right on the rail, and he was cut in half, right along this rail. It was as if a train passed over him, and he simply lay down on the rail and waited. Since not only his stomach was cut, but also his arms. But the next train was standing at the station. In general, this old man talked a lot over a cup of tea. For example, I myself saw several times how someone walks in the side tunnels. I didn't pay attention. Maybe they were repairmen checking something. The train is going fast and it's difficult to see who goes there. Until I found out that during the operation of the subway through the tunnels, people do not stagger. After that, he began to look closely, until the neighbor advised against it. You can see what you don't need to see. The machinists themselves sometimes see things that turn them gray by the age of 30. And even turn out to be unfit for cardiovascular diseases. And not rats the size of a bulldog, as people in the 90s loved to scare. Reality, as usual, is scarier than fiction. After all these jumpers under the trains, and those who accidentally fall under them, as they say, they stay in the subway. For example, a fairly well-known case when a drunk driver decided to piss and fell out of the cab. In that place, as the drivers say, sometimes they see a girl in a white dress walking along the tracks. If she goes in the direction of the train, then you just need to quickly pass, get cold, and that's it. But if she goes forward, then that's it. The driver will live for 3 days, not more. And sometimes these can not only be seen, but also heard. When the train is in the tunnel, then, you can sometimes hear light footsteps on the roof. Especially in the early morning and late evening, when there are few people in the train. Or, standing near the door, distinguish scratching and tapping from that side. And who has not heard the screams at the station, when people begin to look around, and no one can understand who it was shouting. And yet in these screams you can feel differences from ordinary, human voices. And the cases when people catch heart attacks in the train are also not always so simple, which are explained by stuffiness and lack of oxygen. Who knows what looked into the window of the train cabin, and what these people saw? Throwing a random glance outside. The lines laid in the center are especially susceptible to this. A neighbor told how near the Lenin Library he stopped the train on the stage, waiting for the permission signal. And on the right, directly opposite the driver's cab, he saw a dark corridor. Well, a corridor and a corridor, there are plenty of them in the subway, and even more in the center. He stands, and then for some reason looks to the right side. And in the depths of the corridor he saw a whitish figure. It just stood there, but grandfather says that he was sweating all at once. But there is still no signal, so you have to stand. How much time has passed, grandfather does not remember. He looked only at the signals. When, finally, the resolving light came on, he rushed from there like a stung in the ass. But he could not resist and looked to the right side again. There, outside the window he saw, a face hung in the air. Translucent, completely motionless. With inhumanly wide cheekbones. As if it had been stretched, and white balls instead of eyes. Neither he nor the other drivers saw this corridor again. So don't look too closely at what is rushing past the train window, because you don't know what can look at you from there. So, one more story from grandfather. It was another working day, or rather night. On the way from the hostel to the subway, he met another worker from his shift, who was returning home either on a walk or from a store. They got into a conversation about how things are going, word for word, and the conversation turned to work. So, acquaintances told the shifter that somewhere on the Falskaya line, like between the Fili and Bagrationovskaya stations. Grandfather did not remember exactly. In short, on the open section of the tracks, a complete fuck-up was happening. Linemen didn't really like open paths. The problems with them are the most, they constantly have to remove sticks, branches, stones from the paths. And no one wants to linger in open space at night, especially in winter. Sometimes it happened that homeless people and other vagrants climbed into the tunnels from the street for the night. In short, they did not like open paths, but, as you can see, there were reasons. But that time it was really bad. The linemen were marked at the station, left for this stage, and did not appear at the next station. So 3 people had already disappeared this way at that time. These people were not seen later. The bodies were not found either. Strange things, in general. Well, we talked, and grandfather, meanwhile, was already late for work. After saying goodbye, he finally reached the subway, went down to the station, changed clothes and went around. From Navajarivo to Perovo everything went as usual, but then strange things began. At first, grandfather felt a strange smell, not exactly a stink, but, according to him, a very strange, slightly sweet, heavy smell. Furthermore, several rats ran out in his direction, which rushed on, as if not noticing the man. Rats, by the way, are quite ordinary, as grandfather used to say. Stories about giant rats the size of a dog are fiction. In any case, he had never seen such ones in his career. Although hefty ones, the size of a kitten, met. The light of the flashlight was directed further along the path, but grandfather did not see anything strange. Walking a little further, he heard a sound. The sound of pouring water. Now this puzzled grandfather a little. He moved on, illuminating the walls and ceiling of the tunnel with his lantern. In the end, after a few minutes, he came across the source of the sound. The water pipes passing along the wall were, according to the grandfather, as if torn out by something. The torn sections of the pipes were bent outward and water flowed out of them. Here grandfather became frightened, because no one knew who could break thick iron pipes like that. However, there was still quite a bit to go to the highway enthusiast station, and grandfather decided to go and report, to let the repairman figure it out. But here's where it started to get really messed up. He felt a breath of warm air blow into the back of his head, and quite strongly, as if someone exhaled behind him. He rushed forward, stumbled over a sleeper and fell. He quickly rolled over onto his back and shone the flashlight straight ahead. The darkness of the tunnel receded, but grandfather did not notice anything supernatural. After lying for a minute in this position, he gradually began to calm down and got up. When he heard a rustle from the direction from which he had come, and then laughter. As grandfather said, he did not understand whether it was female or male laughter. The voice seemed to be greatly distorted, but it was on a very high note. It came from the same place where the rustling came from. Grandfather began to back away, illuminating the tunnel in front of him. When he heard the same laughter behind him, but now it was heard both behind him and in front of him, then he realized that he was a complete ass, and it was no longer even fear, but animal horror. According to him, he didn't think much. He was shaking and he was trying to figure out how to get out and run away from there. In the meantime, more and more rattles began to be heard from all sides. Then grandfather just sat down, leaning against the wall of the tunnel, and began to shine in both directions, trying to understand what was happening there. At that very moment, he saw the light of a lantern in the distance and was called by name. He jumped up and rushed towards the light, dropping his lantern. It turned out that it was his colleague, who was sent to look for grandfather. According to the lineman, grandfather had been gone for 2 hours, and people were sent to search for him. Grandfather stood silently listening to his colleague, rejoicing that he remained intact, realizing at the same moment that there were no more strange sounds. After listening to the story about torn pipes, the lineman just nodded and said that he had already seen them, and began to worry about it. As a result, having kept silent about the strange shit that had just happened, and hastily inventing something about lack of sleep and the fact that he probably just passed out, grandfather suggested the lineman go to the station. Having reached the place where he dropped the lantern, grandfather bent down to pick it up, and, rising, his gaze fell on the pipes that were accidentally illuminated by his flashlight. On both sides of the place where he sat, shaking with fear, the pipes were slashed with rather deep scratches, about 10 meters in each direction. Looking back at his colleague, grandfather saw only an understanding look and, nodding to each other, they went on. Mystical bullshit was a common thing, and such a screwed up thing was rare, and if a person did not want to talk about what happened, then they did not ask him especially. Grandfather was still grateful to that guy for the fact that he appeared so on time. If not him, then nobody knows what could have happened. Again, it turned out strange that he had been in the tunnel for 2 hours. It turned out that he had been sitting there for more than an hour and was shaking with fear. He himself did not know how he had not gone crazy from this. Sometimes things like that happen, guys.
I hope that you enjoyed tonight's broadcast. If you enjoyed tonight's story, then please subscribe to the channel as more green texts will appear daily. A new broadcast will appear when the clock strikes midnight Central Time.
Remember to check out the Odyssey page in the description for a second archive of the channel's videos.